Yes. Burn! Burn! Yes? Games that feature heavy issues are few and far between. It's kinda strange how rare developers use the medium of video games to try and convey deeper messages about long-standing issues with society as a whole. Maybe they're trying not to alienate any of their crowd, or cause an uproar like Tiny Tina from Borderlands. In the end, when a game that tries to push forward despite the possible negatives, you can bet that I pay a lot of attention to it. Bioshock Infinite is one such game. Hailing from publisher 2K Games and developer Irrational Games, the game opens with a religious utopia in the sky that is, well, not quite as utopian as we thought. Released earlier this year, Bioshock Infinite is the continuation of the franchise that struck a huge chord with gamers back in '07 with its industrial underwater city, returning this time with a haven above the clouds rather than below the waves. Players take control of Booker DeWitt, a seemingly down-on-his-luck private investigator with a lot of gambling debts. In order to pay these debts back, DeWitt is sent to the floating utopian city of Columbia to collect a mysterious young girl, Elizabeth, and deliver her to an unnamed group or person. Aesthetically, the city is absolutely beautiful. The floating city combines the political symbols and stark brick buildings of colonial America together wonderfully, accentuating the look with huge statues of the forefathers and other important figures. Buildings can move about, attaching and detaching to each other and giving the city a feeling of constant motion, despite most of the events being scripted. The people of Columbia are much the same, going about their business with a zealous intent evident in each step, or idling about and chatting the latest news with their fellow citizens. The introduction to the game shoves all this down your throat at once. It is overwhelming to the senses, but at the same time pleasing, showcasing a city that is not simply a dead backdrop to a game, but a living organism, influencing the happenings around it. The reason I start with this is because exploration is a huge part of the series, a benchmark that I will always weigh Bioshock on. The ability to look around, not as a character being shoved forcefully to the next encounter, but to be a tourist, and not just a troublemaker in another city from another time. The game has a great sense of when to cut slack from the action, allow for exploration and story to take the wheel, and it takes full advantage of the player's curiosity about Columbia as a whole to fuel itself forward, something which very few games can claim to do. Plus, the beginning of the game is one of the most perfectly executed introductions I have ever played through, not because of any action set pieces, but because of its simplicity. There is a church, water covering the floor and flowing towards some unknown entity or destination. Candles flicker and smoke lazily fills the air. A church choir hums in the background, harmony to the environment. Later, you find locals attending a fair, cheering for their friends to win games and merchants peddling their wares, promising satisfaction and greatness if you simply spare a few silver eagles. The only hint of being anywhere but a regular city center is the occasional clank of metal clasps in the distance as another island of building latches on, securing itself into place among the scene. It's surreal, artistic. It's phenomenal. The awe-inspiring exploration doesn't end there either. As you journey throughout each district of Columbia, the variety of settings is fantastic. Each area has a very distinct visual style. Even as the game begins to wrap itself up, it continues tossing in new places, which make taking the extra time to wander about an absolute joy. Unfortunately, though, the image is broken when the game breaks out combat. Weapons are oddly conventional, especially in comparison with some of the weapons in other Bioshock titles. The armory this time around is made up of traditional firearms, like the shotgun or machine gun, and leaves remarkably little for customization. Even the upgrades, which can be bought at local vendors, do not change the visual elements of the gun, but merely add a percentage of one stat or another, which was kinda disappointing. The gunplay is remarkably average. Shoot this, shoot that, watch the health bar fall, and when it dies, gather your loot and heal up. Bioshock does feature its traditional form of magic, this time called vigors rather than plasmids. Vigors come in 8 unique flavors, each contained in a nice custom bottle that details what it does. Early on, the vigors are fairly boring, allowing you to light people on fire, toss them in the air, swarm them with a rather ineffective group of crows. Later on, they become a little bit more interesting, integrating things like undertow and the traditional shock. They form a natural combo together, allowing the player to wet and incapacitate enemies, while then going for a nice electric shock to remove them from combat entirely. Even with these natural combos emerging later in the game, I still found it almost unnecessary to use them. By the time that cohesive use of the two vigors was possible, I found that I already had skills that were far superior and less time-consuming, which led to less experimentation in order to maintain my effectiveness in combat. Replacing the original tonic system from Bioshock is gear. Lying about in secret areas throughout Columbia, the player can find gear, which is essentially clothing. These clothing items allow you to minorly increase things like reload speed, or the more adventurous can even make it so that when you fall from a great height, you cause a large area of effect explosion. Infinite's larger conflicts can take up quite a bit of territory, at times even several of its floating islands. Thankfully, the game doesn't require the player to mosey their way through on foot, which, to say the least, would be a tedious affair. Early in the game, the player is given a weird doohickey that allows DeWitt to attach to sky rails that snake throughout the environment. These rails are essentially roller coaster rails, which allow the player to quickly zip to and fro and occasionally even pounce on enemies from above. It adds an interesting, very fast element to combat, encouraging players to use speed and positioning to turn the tide of larger conflicts to their advantage. The final new addition to Infinite's combat is Elizabeth herself, the woman we came for, the big prize. You get the gist. Elizabeth can open tears to other realities, bringing objects into play that otherwise would not exist. Unfortunately, the range of these objects is fairly limited, usually a turret, health stash, or ammo stash. This lack of options generally makes choosing which ones are more useful a very quick affair in a tap of the use key, rather than a key element to turning the tide of the fight to your favor. Elizabeth is a great companion. While not particularly strong in terms of being a female character, she does assist by tossing DeWitt ammo and using her powers when commanded to. The time where she does have the free will to do something on her own is wonderful, showing a lively young woman who just wants to live a life outside a tower. Sadly, the game's plot does take a downward turn as the game progresses. I suppose it just didn't make sense to me, as some of the solutions just seem exquisitely over the top. Like the writers just decided to warp the greater bits of the story so they could drive the ending they wanted. It fails simple logic throughout, using huge acts to solve incredibly simple problems. The worst offender is the ending, which defies all the rules the world had attempted to set up, and it goes on its merry way. It completely destroys the enormous impact the ending could have had. I suppose, even with some of the more stupid scenes, and the tragically poor ending, the entire game still oozes the same character that made the introduction so perfect. It's a shame that the writing didn't live up to the rest of the experience, but the rest of the experience manages to make everything seem very compelling despite it. The game's many magnificent parts far outshine the flaws that it has, and thankfully doesn't much change the conclusion at the end of the day. Infinite is a fantastic experience, a wonderful addition to the franchise, and anyone who could play it should. Bioshock Infinite from Irrational Games gets a 9 out of 10, and is available on Steam now for $59.99 or your regional equivalent. Until next time, cheers and stay awesome.